I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Dame Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm afraid to say it is going to be a rather morbid adjournment debate this evening, because the fact is we spend remarkably little time in our lives thinking about the practicalities of death. It's probably part of human nature that we don't really dwell too much on the inevitable future fate that awaits us, but that means we put far too much implicit trust in those who take responsibility for our bodies and those of our loved ones when we die. We all assume that in death we will be treated with respect and care by professionals, but this evening I'm afraid I'm going to share some hard truths about the gruesome reality of death, and I should warn anyone watching that I'm afraid what I have to say will be graphic and distressing, and there's no way around this. Last year, Gosport residents and funeral directors Richard Elkin and Hayley Bell were found to have kept 46 bodies entrusted to their care in a completely inappropriate environment and unregulated temperature. Describing entering the place to see his mother, one of my constituents said, "The awful smell is something that will never leave me." Concerns about what was going on behind the doors of Elkin and Bell funeral directors were first raised by local residents and then by the senior coroner at Queen Alexandra Hospital in Portsmouth. A body had been sent for post-mortem that was, and I quote, "laying in pools of bodily fluids and infested with maggots." The post-mortem also found that the deceased individual had suffered a spinal fracture after death. After a Gosport Borough Council environmental health investigation raised concerns but took no further action, a few months later, and simply because bills hadn't been paid, bailiffs attended the property where 2 bodies were discovered, putrefying, in a room with blood-stained floors, water dripping from the ceiling, and broken windows. One of them was an elderly gentleman who had been left for 36 days, and his body was found in a very badly decomposed condition. It's too much of a cliche to compare this to a horror movie, because this is real life or real death. And when the families of one of those deceased was contacted, they were very surprised, because they were under the impression that their loved one had already been cremated. In fact, they certainly had taken payment for it. But I want to tell the Minister, I'm sure he already knows, that it was completely legal for Elkin and Bell to keep dead bodies in a room like this. Elkin and Bell could only be brought to justice by some incredibly diligent work by Hampshire Police, the Crown Prosecution Service, and KC John Price, using a variety of different offences, including fraud, forgery, and a piece of common law that dates back to Victorian times. The crime of preventing lawful and decent burial was actually dusted off from the days when it was used to convict grave robbers. And that's instead of what should have been possible, sentencing the pair because they had willfully neglected the bodies in their care and created and treated people's loved ones as nothing more than money spinners. This case highlighted that the funeral sector is nothing better than a Wild West. When this was first brought to my attention, I was incredulous. I was horrified to learn that there is no regulation of any kind governing this sector. In fact, the only law that governs the funeral industry is around the financial transparency of funeral plans, and that was after a CMA investigation in 2021. There are simply no mandatory qualifications, no accreditation, no licensing, no designated working practices or formal inspection, and crucially, no law to fall back on when things go wrong. I would.
Shannon. Thank you, Madam Deputy. First of all, can I commend the Honourable Lady for Gosport for bringing this forward? She's absolutely right to bring this. And I was talking to the Honourable Lady beforehand, I mentioned about Northern Ireland, where we're very fortunate to have a number of funeral directors were long-standing with impeccable reputations and integrity. But on the whole, funeral directors in Northern Ireland are not regulated either. But the trade bodies like NAFD and SAIF require members to follow codes of practice. Many operate within this oversight, though prepaid funeral plans are FCA regulated. So does a member agree that more must be done to protect the general public and instill confidence in a regulated system? That's the way forward.
Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right. This is exactly what we're pushing for here, is better regulation, and in fact everything needs to be better when it comes to the services that the organisations that govern these services. And as he says, and I have to say at this point, the vast majority of funeral services up and down this country work with incredible professionalism, great pride and integrity. They care deeply about what they do and the families and the individuals that they look after. One funeral technician told me that she doesn't see her work as a job, she sees it as a privilege. It's businesses like this and individuals like her who have been silent pillars of our communities for centuries. But I will give way.
Thank her for giving way. She's making a powerful speech on an incredibly difficult topic. On behalf of my constituents, Cody and Liam Townend, and also Zoe Ward, who had horrific things happen to their babies' bodies as a result of the lack of regulation, I spoke with both main professional bodies that cover 80% of the sector and lots of businesses, including the biggest player in the sector, and they are united in that they think that regulation is the answer to restore trust, public trust, in the funeral sector. Does she agree?
He's absolutely right, and I'm about to go on to make exactly that point. I'm so grateful to him for teeing it up so beautifully for me, because, as I say, it only takes one organisation, one business to do the wrong thing to erode trust. But unfortunately, the case of Elkin and Bell is not the only one. There were similar cases in Legacy's Independent at Hull and Florrie's Army, which I think is the one he's referring to, in Leeds, where deceased babies were staged in lifelike positions in a living room. These are just unspeakable, aren't they? Unimaginable horrors. There have been others as well, where bodies have been found in the most unimaginable condition, but where no further action has been able to be taken by the police or others, because simply and quite incredulously, they haven't actually broken any laws. And yes, of course.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and the Minister will know this is the second adjournment debate on this issue that he's had to respond to in these last several months. Does she share my concern that, given the fact that most of the practitioners want to see regulation, the public want to see regulation, that it does seem strange that the government seems to be very slow on this issue, unless the Minister is going to give us some earth-shattering news this evening? This is too vital and important a set of circumstances just to leave to an unregulated marketplace in continuation. It does need regulation, and it needs it quickly.
Caroline Dinage.
Well, I'm grateful to him for his intervention, and may I put on record my thanks to him when he was the Justice Minister responsible for this, for listening to me when I first brought his attention to this situation. And he's absolutely right. I mean, over the last couple of years, I've met with the two voluntary trade bodies for the funeral sector, the Society of Allied and Independent Funeral Directors and the National Association of Funeral Directors, as well as countless reputable funeral businesses and, crucially, many of the families impacted in the case. I'm so grateful for all of them for the time that they gave me. But as he says, every single one of them has stressed the need for this sector to be better regulated. And I would echo his calls for the Minister in a minute to give us some good news on that, because it's important for everybody, because otherwise all those who do carry out their work with such enormous care and diligence have to operate under this shadow of suspicion. We owe it to them as much as anyone else to get this right. The Minister knows that malpractice is not uncommon. Quite simply, taboos and sensitivities around death have created effectively a smokescreen for bad care. And I'm especially concerned about one area which I wanted to talk about, which is the rise in direct cremations. For those who don't know what that is, it's where the loved ones don't actually see their deceased at any point in the journey. So in their cases, there are absolutely no safeguards, no checks and no balances. And the key thing here is direct cremations have expanded hugely in the last few years, and partly as a result of COVID, from just 3% of funerals in 2019 to now 20% in 2023. And we all see the charming adverts on the television, an elderly gentleman explaining with a smile that he has arranged for himself a direct cremation. I just didn't want any fuss, he says. It's much easier for my children. But I think if the children knew what a direct cremation might be. And we know, again, that there are some very reputable and caring businesses that do this, but it might be little better than a conveyor belt in which mum and dad are bundled into a van, maybe still in their soiled nightclothes, maybe with a catheter still attached, without any form of temperature controls, who knows, taken to an unknown location and left for days before a slot becomes available at a crematorium, in the hands of an unscrupulous company, and who knows which ones they are. It is all too possible for any human dignity and respect to become a completely unnecessary complication and expense in this process. The only requirement before cremation to take place is that the body needs to be rid of objects like pacemakers and other medical equipment. And this was another part of my journey through understanding this process, because I was really shocked to learn that this surgical procedure, carried out by embalmers who also drain the body of blood in order to replace it with embalming fluid. They remove the contents of a stomach. Now, this can be performed without any accreditation or qualification whatsoever, and no minimum standards of care for the body. Now, that's not to say there isn't a form of qualification. The British Institute of Embalmers provide professional training, and reputable companies like the Cooperative Funeral Directors require them. They require a level 5 apprenticeship qualification for their embalmers, but that is not mandated to be able to practice. So in a nutshell, Madam Deputy Speaker, any one of us in this room today, if our political career doesn't work out, could walk out of here, set up our own funeral home in our houses if we wanted to, with no special skills, no accreditation, and nobody inspecting our work. With this as the starting point, who can ever say for sure that their family member was treated with the appropriate professionalism? So the question for the Minister, and I know he's been hoping that I got to this for some time, is what can the government do to restore trust in this sector? It's unfair on those who do practice with enormous integrity that their professionalism is being called into question. He will know that the Fuller inquiry was set up in the wake of the crimes of necrophiliac David Fuller. Now, David Fuller abused 100 dead women and girls in the hospital mortuary in Kent. These were women between the ages of 9 and 90. But in the wake of the cases like Hull and Gosport, Sir Jonathan Michael, who led this work into the Fuller report, was asked by the government to prepare stage 2 of the report, and that would consider the wider funeral sector and those working in it. This report was published last July, and it includes some very sensible recommendations, Madam Deputy Speaker, including a statutory regulatory regime for funeral directors that invokes a licensing scheme, mandatory standards, and regular inspection. I will.
I thank her for giving way. This is a really important debate. But while regulation of the funeral sector is fundamental, does the honourable member agree that it must be proportionate? A small, independent home carer for 20 or 30 a year cannot be expected to mirror the administrative burdens of a large multi-site corporate provider? And does she agree that core standards must be universal, but they must be related to the structure and the scale of the business?
Caroline Dinage.
Yeah, I mean, thank you to the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I don't think that necessarily size is any reflection of the professionalism of a business. We know that there are a large number of small independent funeral services up and down the country who work with incredible professionalism. And he's right that there shouldn't be anything introduced which is unnecessarily bureaucratic or costly for them. But if I could just go back to this Fuller report, what it quotes is, "It is important that real change is implemented to ensure the security and dignity of the deceased, and that a specific government department is given responsibility for overseeing this." So everybody who's involved in this sector recognises that there is a need for this to be properly regulated and inspected and overseen. So I'm asking the Minister if he could set out give me 2 minutes, please. So can the Minister set out very clearly what his initial thoughts are on these recommendations from the Fuller report, when the government will respond in full? And when they do so, will they clearly set out what firm action will be taken and when? Because when they do respond, we've waited so long, it must be with clarity, it must be with purpose, and above all, with urgency. I'll give way.
The Honourable Lady very much for giving way. I wondered when the Minister is replying whether he might actually be really clear about whether it is the Department for Health or whether it really is the Department for Justice who should have some control over this particular area, this arena, because there seems to be a bit of a wrestling match going on between the two, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady would agree. It needs to be in one place so that there's definite control over this particular sector.
Thank you so much to the Honourable Lady for raising that. She's absolutely right. It's crucial to know which government department's going to take the lead on this and to ensure that it happens, because while I think the Minister will be responding to the Fuller report, at the same time we're also waiting on the outcome of a Law Commission report, which was kicked off by the previous but one Justice Minister, the member for Finchley and Golders Green in 2022. That's looking at different laws around what happens to our bodies after death, but it doesn't include the regulation of funeral directors. But my fear, and as the Honourable Lady's just said, my fear is that efforts to regulate the sector will fall between the silos of government departments and nobody will grip it. So what is required, I think, is a minimum standard of qualification, accreditation or licensing and robust inspection. We've already discussed that. A regulator with the powers to withdraw licences and sanction wrongdoers could seem like a very tempting first step, and Scotland is ahead of England here. They've passed legislation 10 years ago to introduce a licensing and inspection regime. However, 10 years on, not a single Scottish funeral director that I've spoken to has actually been inspected. And I have concerns that this could be the worst of both worlds, the illusion of regulation masking the possibility that nothing has changed in practice. Now, a very sensible approach to this would be to extend the scope of the Human Tissues Authority beyond public mortuaries and actually through the whole death pathway. Back to the Fuller report. He says the HTA should require the organisations it licenses to ensure that anyone who provides care to the deceased is suitably qualified, experienced and supervised. If inspections are going to be carried out by local authorities, they need to be significantly better trained and resourced to do so. And of course, this would have to take into consideration the fact that some of them run funeral services of their own, so they can't mark their own homework. Inspections must have public trust. The regulator can ensure aligning their minimum codes of practice with those provided by the two voluntary trade bodies we've already heard about, SAFE and NAFD. I'm also concerned about the existing marketplace in training. For sums of money in the thousands of pounds, professional qualifications are delivered by the BIFD, the British Institute of Funeral Directors. Now, at face value, that seems quite promising as well. After all, these courses are accredited by the University of Greenwich, Madam Deputy Speaker. So far, I've seen absolutely nothing that gives me confidence in the legitimacy of their work, particularly in light of the fact that Hayley Bell, now sentenced to 4 years in prison, Hayley Bell of the Elkin and Bell fame, was in fact one of their examiners. If their own examiners cannot uphold even the most basic standards of care for the dead, what is the value of the qualifications that they are selling people? And just as important as qualifications is a person's suitability for a job. Surely a lesson of the Fuller case is that funeral technicians and embalmers, as well as anyone else involved, should be DBS checked. The death pathway, as we've heard, is open to so much abuse, and I'm warning the Minister now that the cases I've mentioned can only be the tip of the iceberg while there's no regulation to tackle them, and that will require a whole system of changes, not just licensing and inspection, but in some cases this could be achieved by expanding existing legislation like the Human Tissues Act, and as we've already said, it's got to be done in a way that's not punitive on small independent businesses. I would also like the government to explore the possibility of a new crime, that of the mistreatment of a body after death, because we can't keep relying on Victorian common law. And we must ensure that the death pathway is so much clearer and that it runs more smoothly to provide a minimum of opportunity for things to go wrong. For example, I've heard in some cases bodies are already decomposing by the time they make it to a funeral director because of the lack of medical examiners who sign off death. So what reassurance can the Minister assure me that his department is going to improve standards in this area as well? I also believe that for full accountability and trust in the system, a clear method of tracking the bodies is necessary. One of the most heartbreaking parts of the Elkin and Bell trial was the story of baby Albie, who died after just 11 minutes of life, and his parents still have no clear picture of what happened to his body after it was taken into the care of Elkin and Bell. Every step of the journey, identification numbers and proof of licence should be shown when a body is passed from one responsible authority to another. And without that, families simply don't have the certainty that their family members have been well treated, or even that they have actually been reunited with the correct ashes. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm coming to a conclusion you'll be pleased to know, but why is this important? We all know some people who say, I don't care what happens to me after I'm dead, I won't know anything about it, and it's a truism that funerals are for the living. And I've been heartbroken by the stories I've heard from families who regret the arrangements that have been made for loved ones, stories of feeling racked with guilt, unable to say goodbye, in the way that they wanted. Grieving is such an important part of the human ritual, regardless of your religion or beliefs. We are elected to Parliament to make things better, to improve people's lives, but today I'm asking the Minister to commit to improving people's deaths, to restore dignity in death, and to ensure that our loved ones are treated with the care, the professionalism that they deserve.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm really grateful to the Honourable Lady, the Member for Gosport, for securing this important debate and for her continued advocacy on behalf of her constituents. As the Honourable Member for North Dorset highlighted, I was here at this dispatch box not so long ago on the same topic, responding to the Honourable Gentleman. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all recognise the profound importance of ensuring dignity, safety and high-quality standards of care for people during life and after they die. Bereaved families place immense trust in funeral directors to guide and support us through one of the most difficult and distressing times of our lives and ensure our loved ones are laid to rest with the utmost respect. They rightly expect that high standards, professional conduct and appropriate oversight are firmly in place. However, as these deeply troubling cases, including the appalling events in the Honourable Lady's constituency, demonstrate, alongside the events in the Honourable Gentleman for Leeds South West constituency demonstrates, this trust cannot always be assumed. Although these cases are rare, they have revealed serious weaknesses in our system, as the Honourable Lady has adumbrated this evening. Unacceptable and distressing incidents, such as bodies being stored or treated in ways that cause deep anguish, were able to occur, and in some instances, the police lacked the powers they needed to act. In the case of Elkin and Bell, the two funeral directors in the Honourable Lady's constituency, charges included intentionally or recklessly causing a public nuisance, the common law offence of preventing the lawful and decent burial of a body, carrying on a business with intent to defraud creditors, or another fraudulent purpose. The Ministry of Justice is actively exploring options to strengthen criminal law protections for the deceased, including the potential for new offences, as outlined in the Law Commission's 14th programme of work. This work will identify gaps in the current law and whether new offences are needed to address behaviours that fail to treat a deceased person with dignity and respect. I'm pleased to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have already taken steps to strengthen and improve standards to safeguard the security and dignity of the deceased. As you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, my department is responsible for coordinating the government's response to Phase 2 of the Fuller inquiry. In December 25, the government published its interim update outlining the progress that has been made against the 75 recommendations. Of these, 11 have been accepted in full, 43 are accepted in principle, and 21 remain under consideration. The 11 recommendations accepted in full cover standards, data and operating procedures in the wider health sector. Highlights from these include the Human Tissue Act Authority's publication on 1st December, updated guidance to ensure that adverse incidents in the anatomy sector are recorded, and NHS England's agreement to introduce data collection on conveying deceased patients in ambulances for the first time in 26-27. Since I was last here at the dispatch box responding to the Honourable Gentleman from North Dorset, the Human Tissue Authority has also issued universal and generic best practice guidance for those responsible for the care and dignity of the deceased, including organisations that are not formally regulated by the HTA. I think this point is particularly pertinent in relation to the Honourable Lady's comments around increasing numbers of direct cremations. In addition, the HTA has begun reviewing its codes of practice, a process that will continue into 2026-27. This review may lead to changes to the current guidance in light of the Fuller Inquiry recommendations and will help us to consider whether the codes could be applied and used by other settings. Before turning to the discussion about the options to strengthen and improve standards to safeguard the security and dignity of the deceased, I would like to remind the House of how we got here. Following the unspeakable crimes committed by David Fuller, as has been already highlighted, the previous government established an independent inquiry sponsored by the Department of Health and Social Care to investigate how a member of staff was able to carry out such unlawful and abhorrent acts in hospital mortuaries and how those actions went unnoticed. I must make it clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, crimes like David Fuller's are extremely rare. However, that will come as little consolation to their families involved. At this point, I extend my deepest sympathies to these families who continue to bear the weight of suffering and for whom it must also be particularly triggering when debates like this are held in this chamber. Phase 1 of the inquiry focused on the crimes Fuller committed in the mortuaries at Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust. The Phase 1 report, published in November 2023, identified failures of management, governance, regulation and a lack of curiosity, enabling Fuller to continue his repeat offending. The Phase 1 report set out 16 recommendations for the Trust and 1 for local councils. In February 2024, the Trust published an assurance statement on the implementation of the recommendations from the Phase 1 report. Kent and East Sussex County Councils reviewed and confirmed that their contracts with the Trust require compliance with licensing and regulatory standards to ensure the deceased are treated with dignity and respect. On 15th July 2025, last year, the inquiry published their Phase 2 final report, which looked at the care of the deceased in both hospital and non-hospital settings. It acknowledged that arrangements for the care of deceased people are complex and often interconnected. It clearly set out multiple organisations with different governance and operating models who are spread out across a large number of sectors. It focused on whether procedures and practices in hospital and non-hospital settings, including the funeral sector, are doing enough to safeguard the security of the deceased, and it considered the role of regulators. But the inquiry's chair, Sir Jonathan Michael's overall recommendation was for government to introduce an independent statutory regulatory regime to protect the security and dignity of people after death in all settings where deceased individuals are cared for, regardless of the institution. This includes funeral directors. 11 of the Phase 2 recommendations relate to introducing statutory regulation, including the funeral sector. These remain under consideration. Through the Fuller Inquiry's Recommendations Programme Board, established in July last year, work continues at pace with the Ministry of Justice, Department of Business and Trade, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to assess options for the government intervention to improve standards of the care for the deceased within the funeral sector, and as such, responding to these recommendations. I will.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. Can you confirm if any meeting has taken place between those departments, or if one is going to take place and when?
The honourable gentleman is clearly reading my speech, so I can assure him that meetings have taken place prior to my appointment as a minister responsible for the aspects of the regulations in relation to the Department of Health and Social Care, and I can confirm to the House that further meetings are being taken place at my instruction with the relevant ministries hosted by me in the Department of Health and Social Care, so that we can genuinely move forward. I know there is consensus across the House that we genuinely and expediently move forward, aligning not only lines of demarcation and responsibility across those departments, but as has already been outlined in this House, that we work genuinely together and show leadership on this issue. And I'm happy to keep honourable members who are interested in this updated in that regard to those meetings when they take place. This is a complex and sensitive matter, Madam Deputy Speaker, that requires careful and thoughtful consideration to safeguard the rights and dignity of those who have died, to support their bereaved families, and to ensure that any measures taken are, of course, proportionate, given the fact we are working with a number of SMEs. To support this work, I am continuing to discuss progress and next steps with relevant ministers across government, as I have laid out in response to my honourable friend. The Government is therefore continuing to consider all options to ensure that high standards are consistently upheld across the funeral sector. This includes the possibility of introducing suitable and proportionate regulation for funeral directors. As we discuss these options, we are clear that the approach must maintain high standards, protect the dignity of the deceased, support bereaved families, recognising that any additional costs arising from regulation will ultimately also fall on them. At the same time, we must consider the impact on the funeral sector itself. The funeral sector is 6,500 private businesses across the UK, the vast majority of whom, as we've already heard tonight, run and serve their communities with compassion and integrity. 85% are already members of trade bodies that provide guidance, codes of practice and voluntary inspection schemes. The Government is also committed to reducing the administrative burdens of regulation on businesses by 25%, and this will contribute to our approach about regulation in this area. Wrapping up, Madam Deputy Speaker, while the vast...
Is the Minister and other ministers involved with this fully seized of the fact that this is a very unusual situation, in that those professional bodies and the lion's share of practitioners are actually calling for regulation? This is a very unusual feat. They want to see it.
Minister.
I'm very cognizant of that fact, and that will be something we discuss in our interministerial meetings as how we can involve the profession early in this regard. Madam Deputy Speaker, while the vast majority of funeral directors already operate with professionalism, the actions of a small minority have undermined public confidence. We are determined to ensure the security and dignity and care of deceased across all settings. This is why we are committed to setting out the Government's decision on regulation in our full response to the Fuller Inquiry Phase 2 report in summer 2026.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as of that opinion say aye. Or the ayes have it. Order, order.